Alright, we are live. Good Monday morning. I don't know if anyone's out there yet. If you are, please let me know if the audio sounds okay, if you can hear everything, if the music sounds good. And we'll get started on the next part of building Twitter. We're going to start working on the JavaScript side of things today. So I'm just going to get my live server opened up here. And so we'll open up Twitter as well. With a and I think I'll have to go to full screen because we want the actual pop-ups which aren't available on mobile. And so here's where we left off. We got everything done, we got our show mores, we got our buttons with the colors, we got our text. So that's something that we could do too, is actually using local storage, set it up so that we pull this information from local storage instead of from being hard-coded, which would allow us to then be able to add another tweet. But I think the first thing that we'll work on today is these pop-ups. So when I click on here, you can see this pop-up shows up here. And we do have a little diagonal there, so I can show a couple ways we can do that. The other thing, when we hover over, I think, an image, then we get the same thing. And so this one doesn't have that little triangle beneath it, but essentially it's the exact same styling. So we will build a system that is reusable to be able to use for these. I think maybe if I click on follow here, no, unfollow. Yeah, let's follow them. But I think, yeah, here, so it's basically just a white box with a rounded border and a drop shadow that gets placed based on what you're clicking or hovering on. This is the only one that I can see that has the little triangle, and it also is the only one that is a clickable one. So let's get started on the hover ones. And the other thing too, let's see what happens. So this one's always seems to be above. These ones are below or above depending on where you are in the scroll window. So if there's enough room to show it up above, it will be above. And maybe it's even just at the halfway mark, which could be an easier way to determine it, but not as effective. So let's get started. So there's several different ways that we can do this. I think probably the first thing I'm going to do is just get a box and style it and have it show up, and then we can decide how to display it afterwards or how to even create it, because there is, like I say, several ways that we can do this. So I'm going to put it below the main, and I'm just going to give this, let's do this. Not pop up. So we have our pop-up, and what information, let's do the image hover first. So we have at the top, and it's going to be different. So these ones here, that's kind of the same. We've got that there, and then this one here is like a context menu. So this one's actually going to be the easiest one to do, but let's start with this here. So the top, we've got a split, and it's the same here. And obviously this is always going to be the following, so we'll do this button that changes, so we'll have to grab that color. And then we just have our information and some links. So let's scaffold that out. So this is going to be our, actually I think for simplicity, I'm just going to screenshot this and pull it up in Paint. We will just select just this, and is that crop? Where's crop? There we go. And that way we can just have it up to see. So in here we have a header, and it's going to have an image, and we'll throw in, we'll do this, and then we'll have a button, btn, and we'll say following. And this one's actually going to be a btn pop-up. And let's go into our styles, and just for the sake of things now, I'm going to give it a absolute positioned, and we'll give it a top 200 and a left 200, just to make it appear in a specific place. I'm going to give it a width of, say, 300 pixels. Looks about right, because all of these were standard widths, and they do all seem to have a padding. I'll give that a padding of 2 rem, and we'll give it a background color. Do I have a variable for white? I do. Cool. The reason I would use a variable for white is that if I want to change the white across the board, I can do that as opposed, because sometimes it's nice to have like a little bit of a off-white, or you can hue shift the white closer to the colors that are in the site, which actually kind of makes things pair a little bit better. We'll play around with that after at some point, design side of things. So for now though, I will give this the white background color. We'll give it a border radius of, do the same, 2 rem. And then our pop-up header, I think that's what we got here, yeah. We will give it a width of 100%, and we'll display it flex, align items. We're going to do flex start, because that's the way it looks like it starts there, so we don't need to do that, but we will justify content space between, and it looks like we need a border, 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to try the gray text and see how that looks. And then we do have a box shadow, and we'll try doing it, we'll leave it at the center, so no right or left. We'll spread, we'll give it a 5 pixel blur and 0 pixel sort of spread. I think it's blur then spread, but we'll check that out after. And we'll give it an RGBA of 3, just a subtle color, and we may change that as well to same thing, have a bit of a hue shift in there. But let's take a look now what this looks like. So there we go. So it's coming along a little bit. We've got here. So we're building this part here. Same with this here, or not that one, this one. So we think we need a little bit more width, and the border needs to be obviously way more subtle, and the drop shadow way more subtle. So 1 pixel solid is still good. What did I hit? No, I don't want to do that. Gray, let's just try gray S and see what that looks like. And we'll give it a little bit more subtle drop shadow. So that's getting a bit closer. I still think, so I think it's actually the opposite. So I think I want to do 0, which is your spread, and then 5 pixels for the blur. Let's see if that, nope, it is the opposite way. So the first one is how much you want it to blur, and the second one is how much you want it to spread. So this is spreading now 5 pixels. So that's how you can get like a border that doesn't, that's on the outside of the div. And I think the rounded corners are a little bit too much here. Twitter clone, nice. Good morning, Roach Frags. Yeah, this is, so we went from, here's obviously real Twitter, and then here's our version of Twitter. So we've been building it over the last 5 days. I've just been kind of going through my process of developing the HTML and the CSS. And so we've just done the HTML and CSS so far, and this is where we got to without this pop-up here. But now we are going to implement the JavaScript to show the pop-up. So obviously there's quite a few different ways that you can implement this pop-up, but this will be sort of one way that I can do it, and I'll go through a couple different ways that I might approach this problem here. Impressive, thank you. Using any libraries, frameworks, or mainly vanilla? It's all vanilla for now, so it's straight from HTML and CSS. Just literally open up the editor and start typing. My approach for this is, I find in teaching, learning the HTML and CSS first, and then into JavaScript, and then we can put a framework over top of that. So understanding the base, the bare bones HTML and CSS of what the frameworks are doing, I find a really helpful tool. So that's kind of what is happening here, and this is working towards building out a course that we won't be doing Twitter for the course. It might be part of the, I might do a tutorial series on this Twitter building, but the idea will be sort of a similar process. We're going to build the HTML and CSS for a time tracking app, then we'll work on the JavaScript for it, and then we'll apply a framework to it. So it's kind of learning everything from vanilla out to React is probably what we'll build it in the end. Awesome, thank you for the follow. I appreciate that. Are you a coder yourself? How's the volume too? Are you able to, is the music and sound all right? So we'll go back to our spread and blur, and we'll adjust that. You're returning developer trying to relearn. Cool. What, returning from how long of a time off? To be honest, my speakers are terrible. It's hard to say. Okay, cool. Well, it sounds like you're at least able to hear what I'm saying. So if you need me to adjust anything, feel free to give me some suggestions. So that's looking a bit better. I think the button might be a little bit big, so we'll shrink that down slightly, and the image might be a little bit small. And we'll make it a little bit wider, so let's make those adjustments. Haven't done any real coding for like 10 plus years. Oh, interesting. So are you looking to relearn to go back into that sort of as a career change? Let's give it a 1 rem border radius, and let's move it over to like 600 so that it shows up for me. Let's even go 800, and we're gonna make it 400 wide. Not quite that big. Let's go with 320. That looks pretty good. And so we've got a button in there, btn pop-up. We're going to adjust the padding to 1 rem, see how that looks. Let's do 0.5 rem and 1 rem. So that doesn't seem to be adjusting it. Let's take a look and see what we can do there. I was only ever really competent at front-end HTML, CSS. I'm focusing on learning JavaScript right now. Cool. Yeah, hopefully I can get a full stack job one day. Nice. Yeah, so this is actually perfect timing. So HTML and CSS, like I say, is what we did so far in this build, and now we're actually getting into the JavaScript side of things. So we're going to implement the hovers for these, and here, and then this one here. That's kind of the plan for the day, and we'll approach that from a JavaScript perspective, and it'll be vanilla JavaScript too. So I just want to see what styles I've got. So this is my base button, and it has padding 1.5 and 2 rem on there. So what happens if we change it? I think we also, do we have a height on it? No. If we change it to 1 and 1.5, does that look better? Still looks a little big for some reason. What happens if we do 1 as well on the top? So there's like a line height or something that's making it a little bit bigger than what I want. So perhaps actually we just change the line height to 1.6 rem and see how that looks. That does nothing. So let's just refresh, Control Shift R. We'll get back to our Control Shift R. There. Yeah, full stack job is great. Front end is great though. I really love doing front end. Like I think I've been a full stack developer for about 15 years, and it's nice working on the full stack, but there's so much creativity to be able to do on the front end, which is really fun, really nice. So let's try that again. So line height 1, that's not affecting it. And we did give it a class of button. So our padding is showing up. And if we change this to 1.5 rem, 1 rem, 1 rem. So it's interesting that it's affecting the other buttons on the, like this one here, but for some reason it's not affecting this one here. So I think I must have something overriding it. Maybe not. So it is a button. What is this one here if we take a look? This is also a button. And it's got a padding of 1 rem and 1 rem. Oh, that's because I adjusted that. Let's refresh again. So this one looks good, but for some reason, this one here, the button and button pop-up, let's just try explicitly setting it on here. Padding 1 rem. 1 rem. Height auto. Yeah, for some reason it's strange. Sometimes with CSS it's really hard to tell exactly what is happening. So this is a button with the class of button and button pop-up. We haven't added any styles for button pop-up. We've just added this explicit styling here, so I'll remove that. But then if we take a look at this button here, we have the exact same styles. There's nothing else additional to it except for the opacity because it's disabled. But on this one, if I change the padding to 1 rem, it actually shrinks the button down. Whereas on this one, if I change the padding to just 1 rem, it only shrinks it left to right. And so I'm thinking that that has to do with the fact that it's in a Flex container. So if I make this display inline block, no, that's still not doing it. So let's try one other thing. Let's go back into here, and we've got our button here. Let's put it into a div and see if that will adjust it. And let's put some styles on our button pop-up. And let's give that a padding of 1 rem and see what happens there. Okay, so that's working. So for something in the browser, there's some kind of a default setting that was overriding it, or it could be this div that we've added in now, which I think that might actually be the case. Let's just take that out and see if that... Yeah, so because the button is the Flex container, that's what's happened here. So I made the header display Flex, and what that did was make the image and the button the Flex containers within. So because the button was the Flex container, it actually expands vertically to the size of the container. So now that by putting it into a div, we can just style the buttons separately. Livestream7, good morning. How are you? Thanks for stopping by. We're working on some Twitter rebuild here, so I don't know if you've been following along or if you've seen any of the other streams. We did 5 days. This is day 6 here of rebuilding Twitter. So we took, this is obviously live Twitter, and then here's what we built over the last 5 days. And right now it's just bare bones HTML and CSS, just these 2 files. That's all there is for creating this. And so today we're starting to work on the pop-ups. So when you hover over a person's image or click on down here, you get a pop-up. And so that's what we're going to do, and that's going to be implemented using JavaScript. So today's the first day that we're going to start getting into some JavaScript, but we have to style it out first, and then we'll have it show on the screen. You started learning programming in March? Very cool. What kind of programming are you learning? So I'm just going to make it a 1.5 rem all around. Frontend, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Very cool. So this is right up your alley, just what you're learning here. Have you built very many projects yet? Oh, and for anybody too, Roachfrags or Livestream or anyone else watching, here is the Git repository. So if you are interested in this code, you can feel free to use it however you want. You can take a look at the code. It'll be updated at the end of each session, and so there's been pushes at the end of each stream on the Mondays. Cool, you check it out. Nice. Not really. I'm not that good yet. I've been on free code camp. Cool. That's great. I mean, everybody has to start somewhere, and it's really just a practice. The more you do it, the better you get at it, and the more you understand it, and understand the logic, and you start to find patterns. And even through here, building this, it's been a fun project because I've learned a lot, even in my own development. And I've been doing it for 15 years. Going back afterwards too, we'll go through and we'll refactor a bunch of stuff, so you can even see some of my naming conventions are a little bit off maybe here. We can clean up that, which will allow us to start to get into think about building reusable code that makes it so much easier. Once you've built something once, you can reuse that, and so it's really great to be able to identify the things that might be things that you might want to use in the future. Even this pop-up here, so this pop-up that we're going to use, we're going to write some JavaScript to be able to show it. That JavaScript can carry over to any project that you have, and so you may want to style it differently, but the functionality that you have once you've built a pop-up, you can use that on any project going forward. You still here but lurking, just doing some chores? Yeah, no worries, Rich Fred. Cool, lurk away. Thanks for the lurk. So why use rem over pixels? Yeah, so that's a good question. So what I like to do as a technique, so if we look at my styles here, one thing that you can do is, so a rem is relative units to the HTML font size. So by default, the HTML font size on most browsers is 16 pixels. So if I was to use one rem, that would equal 16 pixels. So what I do is I set the HTML font size to 62.5%, which works out to 10 pixels. And the reason that I do that is that then I can start using my rems in here, and if I ever want to make an adjustment to what size everything is, I can actually just adjust the HTML font size. So for doing mobile styling, this is really great. I can do something like, we've got our media query down here. So let's say we want anything that once it gets down to 800 pixels, we actually want to change the HTML font size down to 50%. And what that'll do is everywhere where I've used, I think I can do, everywhere that I've used rems instead of pixels, and this is for spacing as well, so not just for font sizes, it's for spacing. So one rem unit will adjust, and once we get down to our 800 pixels, you'll see everything shrinks. So once we're below that 800 pixels, all the font sizes shrink, all the spacing units shrink, and it keeps it sort of uniform across the site. So it's a really quick trick for being able to do mobile changes without having to go through and edit the rest of your code. Does that make sense? So what the heck is an M? Yeah, so an M is a unit that's relative to its parent font size. So if I have, say, let's find a containing div here. So let me just find something here. So happening here, if we've got a font size here, of say 22 pixels, then something that's underneath it, this meta, I could do font size of 2M, and that would actually make this be 44 pixels. So it's relative to the parent. So because this meta is inside of the happening, relative to that. So if I did 0.5M, then it would be an 11 pixel font. Does that make sense? Whereas a rem is similar, it's relative unit, but it's relative specifically to whatever the HTML font size is set. So it'll always be based on this, regardless of its parents. You get what that means now? Cool. Awesome. So important for accessibility and usability. Yeah, exactly. Most important reason to use rem, in your opinion, is that it respects the user's font size settings. Yeah, that too. It also allows, so when somebody changes their scaling, because the browser scaling is actually based on the HTML font size. So if somebody zooms in and out, it will actually adjust the rem units of your site, which makes it a lot nicer. You hate sites that break down custom font zoom settings on your laptop. Yeah, it's a very subtle thing, but it's definitely a piece of polish that can be added to a website that kind of shows the quality for sure. and gives a better user experience. So if we open up this, next we've got name and some data, the follows, some text, and some more text. So let's just put in some dummy content here. This is our header. This I don't need, that's a rogue. Let's just call this pop-up text. And we'll put these into a spans. So this will be name, and I'm just going to put in John Doe. And so for all the images on here, we're using place beards. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's kind of like place kitten, where basically you send a URL and it'll just return a picture of kittens was in place kittens. This is place beard. It'll just return random profile pictures with guys with beards. So that gives us our name. Then we need our metadata. So let's just copy this. And we'll call this pop-up meta, and we'll give him a fake name of @JohnDoe, and then we do have this follows you, so I'm actually going to make this a div, and I'm going to give it an anchor because it is a link. And in here we'll do the same thing. We'll make this a div. We'll give this an anchor. Oops. And then a span, and then this will actually have a follows. Follows you, because that'll be determined whether or not they follow the person. Let's put these down here, keep this clean. So that gives us that. Then we've got a paragraph tag with just some text in there. I'm just going to use just a bit of dummy text here. We'll just keep it nice and short. And then we've got our followers. So this is pop-up following. Let's call it following. And then this is going to have, we'll just give some numbers. Following, and we'll copy this one. And followers, and we'll just put another number in there. And then our last one here is just going to be another paragraph, not followed by anyone you're following. And actually I'm going to make this be the footer, just to keep it syntactically correct. So that's kind of our basic scaffold. So we're doing this in HTML. Likely I would generate this in JavaScript because it's going to be being displayed up in here. There's a couple different ways that we could do this. We could do it through templating. Obviously if we were using a framework, this would be replaced with data, but we're going to do it in vanilla JavaScript, a way to do it. And I'll show a couple different ways that we can create that. Let's take a look. There we go. So now we've got our data here. So let's start styling that. And so you can see how the font size by default is really small. That's because the HTML default font is that 10%, that's 62.5%. So it does make you kind of have to set something. You can also on the body just set your base font size, but I haven't done that on this particular one here. So I'm going to just shrink this down and pull this in over here so we can see both. Then I don't need the terminal. Let's get to our styles. So the first part is the pop-up text, and this is pretty much the whole thing down to this follower, the footer there. So I'm just going to give it a top and bottom padding. The top padding is very little, the bottom's a little bit more, so. And we're using just plain CSS here too. And the other thing that we may take this sort of as a learning exercise is to take this CSS and convert it into Sass. So how to build the same thing using Sass as well. We'll give a padding top of 1 rem, and nothing on the side, 1.5 on the bottom, and then 0 on the other side. And it looks like actually it's going to be 0.5 and 1 will be better. So that looks pretty good. So now our pop-up name, and then the pop-up meta. I'm going to give a base font size to the pop-up so we can adjust from there. So we'll give it a font size of 1.8 rem, so 18 pixels. That's a bit big. I think 16 pixels. Let's even go 14 pixels. And I can't remember, did I have some font sizes? I didn't. So I'm just using colors in my variables, but you can actually set variables for font sizes as well, which is something that I might do on a bigger project. So that looks pretty good, the 1.4. Let's just move that down again. And now so links in here are all going to be black, so I'll just style basically all links. We'll set the font or the color to inherit. Now the links are that, and then our pop-up name size, we want it a little bit bigger, so 1.6, and we want the font weight to be, let's try 700. That looks good. And the actually none of the links we don't want underlined, so we'll just set text decoration none. And what happens on real Twitter when you hover over the name? Does it have any? It does, so it shows the underline when you hover over it, so we'll do the same. So we'll say when you hover, we'll give the text decoration underline. And so now the subtle text underneath is actually a little bit smaller, so we'll adjust the font size on that, but what do we call that? That's the pop-up meta. So let's do that one next. And so this is like they're doing pop-up meta. Probably don't need to explicitly say this, but it is kind of recommended best practice, and that is what Sass really helps with. So then you wouldn't have to do this, you would actually just nest this pop-up meta underneath pop-up, which keeps it a lot cleaner. But in order to just be proper, I'm just going to do it this way. Font size 1.3 rem, and our color is going to be the gray. Let's just see how that looks. No, I want gray text. That looks good. It follows you. We got some kind of a quote, a rogue quote here, and then we've got this dot follows. So dot follows, and we can just do it this way here. I'm gonna give it a margin left of 1 rem because it looks like it just needs a little bit of space, and then a background color, and we'll use the gray subtle and see how that looks. That looks pretty good, and then it just needs a little bit of padding, so 2 pixels. Anything smaller than 5 pixels, I'll just use pixels. 1.5 rem, so that'd be half a pixel, 5 pixels. So that looks pretty good. I don't quite need this much space. Let's see what it looks like without it. I think we're good, actually. I don't think we actually need that. And maybe we don't need the padding on the top. Maybe just the sides. Yeah, that looks good. So our pop-up meta, we do have a bit of space underneath, so let's do that. Let's give it 10 pixels of space. That looks pretty good. And actually, I think maybe instead of doing that, so in this case I'm doing margin underneath, so I'm explicitly saying that anything underneath there I've got space. Because I've got this paragraph under here that needs space on the top and bottom, I'm just going to give paragraphs within the pop-up a margin of 1 rem on the top. And there we go. So now we got that spacing there. And that just keeps it so that anytime, if there's another paragraph under here or whatever text is in here, we'll have those spacings. And with margins, there's collapsing margins. So if I put a margin of top and bottom on the paragraph tag, and I put a paragraph after another paragraph, the top and the bottom of the upper paragraph and the top of the bottom paragraph will actually collapse together. So instead of having 20 pixels of space, you'll still only have 10 pixels of space. So that's the difference between margin and padding. Also, padding is on the inside of the div, whereas margin is on the outside of the div. So next we need to kind of float these two side by side, and that is our pop-up following. So let's make that a Flexbox. Pop-up following, we'll do this display flex. We'll align the items in the center, and we'll justify them space between. We may need to give this a width. No, it automatically did, so it's already block level. So they've got a bit of space on the side here. Not really sure if that's necessary. What we could do is, because this is all in the pop-up text, which we haven't specified here, so let's just do that. Pop-up text. I don't think we have anyway. Pop-up text, have we? No, okay. We could just do a padding of, say, 3 rem, padding right. Maybe that's not pop-up text. And do pop-up, padding right. Let's try 5 rem. So that's obviously not there we go, that's why. So I did have a pop-up text. Pop-up text, and we've set the top and bottom, but we actually want to put, say, 3 rem on the right-hand side, and that gives us this space over here. I think we will also need to put it on the footer. Padding right 3 rem, just to make it so that it drops all the way down. And I think the footer actually, it looks like the font size is slightly smaller, so we'll do that. Font size of 1.3 rem, and our color will be the gray text. And that should give us that. And I'm just going to move this because I like to try to keep my CSS fairly in the order of that it shows up in the DOM. It's not necessary because, especially with modern editors, search works really good. And then if you, it kind of can be annoying if you like move stuff around, then you have to update your CSS. So it's not a crucial thing, but in general, if I can, I'll just throw the header and the footer at the tops and the content in between as much as possible. So that looks good. So we do have an extra space in here, and so let's just take a look where that's coming from. So this was from our spacing there, and then the footer actually has a paragraph in it, so that's where that spacing is coming from. So I think I'm actually going to get rid of the spacing on in the footer, and the easiest way to do that is, instead of specifying it in here, we can specify it in the pop-up text alone, and that way it's not affecting the paragraph in the footer. So then we just got to lessen the color of the spans in the following. So following, pop-up, following, oops, this should be like that. Interesting. So I typed it right there, but typed it wrong here. So we're using the BEM model, block element modifier, for our naming conventions. It works good for bigger projects. I haven't been following it the whole entire time, so I'll have to go back and do a pass of it, but it is an industry standard kind of used in a lot of cases. So it's something you might see if you're getting a job in this type of industry. So let's just, oh, and it's actually just the spans that I want. No, it isn't, because I didn't put them in spans. This is just the font. We have the strong that's in there. So this is going to override the color of the strong as well, so I'll have to make it back to black. But we'll give this a color of gray text. And then, oops, we will strong, and actually we'll probably want to put it after this. It should be fine either way because we're explicitly specifying strong, so the selector should be stronger, but I'm just going to make this black. And it looks like, no, the font size is about the same. I'm thinking this might be slightly smaller. Font size 1.3 rem, and let's just see if that looks a bit better. I think that looks better. And I just noticed that they use a comma in their thousands place. So there we go. So that is this. Oh, one other thing. So the pop-up button, it changes. So that can be the first thing that we do. So if we go to live Twitter and we hover over the person, the follow button, when you hover, it actually changes the text and it changes the color. So we'll change the color using CSS, and then we'll change the text. That'll be the first thing we do with JavaScript. So let's get that color first. Here. And we want to grab that color. And we'll go into here. And let's put our button. Did we have any button in here? Yeah, button pop-up. So pop-up, hover, and the background color will change to this. And so theirs is a pretty like quick, they don't do any kind of fade, it's just maybe there's a bit of fade, there's a slight fade, it's super subtle though. So let's set that up. So we'll say transition, background color, we'll just say 0.2 seconds, and we'll do it linear. And let's see how that looks. So here's our version. Boom. So ours is a little bit softer. I think it looks nicer that way anyway. Yeah. So let's get started. That's that. There is a different, so this one is a little bit different. The header's kind of similar, but we won't worry about this one for now. We'll work on just the hover for today. So let's get started in JavaScript. So we do have a main.js, which doesn't do anything. It just loads JavaScript so far. It just says loaded JavaScript. And let's just check in our HTML and make sure that we're including it. So we are. We also are including font awesome, which was what I used for the icons. But essentially this is the only JavaScript that we have here. So let's just confirm that that is loading. We'll pull up our console, JavaScript loaded. So when we refresh, JavaScript loaded. And we don't have to worry about our favicon. That's not a big deal. So let's change that button. So I'm going to get a reference to all of those buttons. So we'll say, we'll call them follow buttons. Document dot query selector all, and this is just because we may have more than one of these. We'll say dot btn follow. What is that? Let's adjust that. So button, we'll do dash dash pop up. It's just to follow the BEM model. We'll adjust this and adjust this, and then we will do pop up. And I think actually, yeah, I am going to change this to follow because it is follow or unfollow. So follow, that's fine, and here follow, follow. So everything looks the same. Great. So on there we have our follow buttons now, so we can do follow buttons dot for each. So we can do a for each, and we can do the button dot add event listener mouse over. I think that's the event, and then we will get the event, whoops, target dot inner HTML equals unfollow. And let's just see if that works. Unfollow, there we go. So now we do need the reverse, the opposite though. So we will also need to add an event listener. So this is adding an event listener to each of the follow buttons. So if we were to have multiple of these, each one would have that. And there's a couple different ways that we could do this. I think this This just ensures that if you add a follow button somewhere else, it will provide this functionality. And really we only want to do this if the person is following. So we may actually want, I mean in this particular case I'm already following, so what happens over here? Oh, this is my Twitter. What happens if we go over here? I'm not following this one. So there's something too. So here's a non-followed person, and it just does this subtle button. So we may need to do that as well. So if we hover over this one, but so then here's how we can use this same button follow class over here, and it will show up in that way. It'll handle that text. So, and then this was, we want it to go back to following. Oh, so something's not right there. Oh, mouse over. We want mouse out. Following, unfollow, following. So there's the follow button. So what we want to do is this is actually only if it's button follow dot following. And this is same thing. We want so we'll give it a class of following as well. So this is if the person is following. If it doesn't have this class, then it'll be the other style, this follow style. Follow. And so in order to do that, what we need to do is we'll say not dot following. We want to change the background color to the white. And let's see how that looks. But we are following this person. So let's see what it would look like if the person wasn't following. So obviously this would be entered from the back end. The database would determine whether or not that showed up, was following or not. And so there the background color has changed to white. But we're hard coding things for now. So in here we want to do the border color. And now I'm explicitly setting this up. Now if I add class of following here, now that should work. There, the unfollow. Because this is only if the person is following. If the person isn't following, it should just show up as the other button, the follow. And technically this text should then be follow. So this would probably be output at the time of so what do we want to do actually? Let's just do this. So btn.inner HTML equals so by default we want to set it to following, or here. So if it has a class of following, then we make the text following. Otherwise, we make the text, and it's not e.target here, it's btn follow. And now that should ensure that if it's not following yet, and if we go to here and we add the class of following, it's following. And so what we can do is actually make it so that when you click on the button, it adds that class. So what we want to do is add the event listener either way. Add event listener, click, and we just want to class list.toggle following. I think there's a toggle following. So we go here, follow. It is working that way, but then it's not adding the event handler. So this is a good point actually to work. The one thing I just want to fix either way is the hover effect on this. So let me fix that first, and then we'll take a look at the JavaScript and see what's happening here, because this is a really good thing that you could come across quite easily. So we do have our button inverted and then our not following, and so I think, do we have a button inverted hover? Inverted hover, so we have to do the same for the not following hover, and that should, there we go, so that gives us that subtle blue background instead of the dark blue. And so let's take a look now at what's happening here. So we are getting a reference to all of our buttons that have the class button follow. So this is a follow button, and then for each of them we get the button, and we find out if it already has the class of following, then we set the content to following. If we mouse over it, the inner text gets changed to unfollow. If we mouse out, it goes back to following. Otherwise, we set the inner text to follow. And if we click on the button, we add the class of following. But what you can see is that it actually doesn't update the text. So the reason for that is that this gets ran when the page loads. When I click on it, it doesn't get run again, so these event listeners aren't added to it. So I'm going to actually, to fix that, I'm going to create a function called follow. And it's going to take the button. And what what we need to do is determine whether or not it already is following. So we can do this. So let's do let is following equal this. So this tells me if they are following or not. If is following, then we want to do this. So if it's following, we set the inner HTML to following, and then we add these event listeners. Otherwise, we set the text to just follow. And that way we can get rid of this part in here, and we just have the click, and in there, oh, we do want to also so we toggle it first. So we want to btn.classlist.toggle following. So when you click on the button, the first thing that happens is it either will set it to following or not. So it'll add or remove this. And then we determine what that is. I'm not sure if this actually returns whether or not. Let's take a look at that. But essentially, here's the full way of what happens here. When we hit follow, it sends the button, it toggles the class, so it turns it on or off, and then we find out if it has the class or not. And then if it's following, we set the inner HTML text to following, and we add these mouse over event listeners. Otherwise, we set the inner HTML to follow. And that way, all we have to do is add the click event handler, and instead of having all of that logic in there, we can just do follow e.target. And this should let us toggle that following. So right now we're following, but it doesn't have the class. So we've got it kind of opposite here. Is following. So if it contains following, so what's happening let's console log is following and see what that does. So right now, and let's take a look, does it have the class right now? It does not have the class right now, so we are following. So this should actually be the blue, not the subtle here. So that's one piece that I'm not sure what's going on there. Let's take a look. Not dot following, not dot following. And what have we got? It's not. Oh, that's okay. So starting with the following, let's make it start with following. It's got following. When we hover, the color changes, but the text doesn't. When we click on it, it switches to this. It removes the class. Okay, so the first time it didn't add the event listener. So that's where the problem is first. So we do want to run. We do need to add these mouse overs the first time if it has that class. So this is an interesting problem to solve, actually. There's a lot of logic going on here. So what's happening now is when I refresh the page, we've got the hover color because that's straight in the CSS, but obviously it's not adding that unfollowing. And the reason for that is because we go into here, we add the click target, but it's never added this mouse over the first time. So we could duplicate this logic and put it into here, but that's not really the best way to do that. So I think what we want to do instead is we won't have this do the logic of the click. We'll actually make this be follow to add this information. So let's take this out. So this is just what happens when you follow. It takes the button following, we always want the click to let's create another function, and we'll call this toggle follow, and it's going to take the button. And in here, and then we'll add another function called unfollow btn. So this is the logic that happens when we follow. This will be the logic that happens when we unfollow. So unfollow, the only thing we need to do is do the button.inner HTML, and we'll make it follow, and we will remove event listener, mouse over, and whoops. Mouse out. I think we might have to put the functions in here. I can't remember how the remove event listener works, but we'll take a look at that. And then in here we want to class list dot add following, or this is we want to remove following. For follow, we want to set the inner HTML to following, and then put on these event listeners, and then we want to add the class of following. Add following. And then in here we need to determine if, or let's say, let is following equal target dot has, or class list dot contains following, and then we can say if is following unfollow, otherwise follow. And then we don't need our toggle follow. That's actually kind of, actually we could do that this way. Let's do that. Let's just toggle following. So this actually gets our button, unfollow button, and follow button. And then that way we can just say toggle follow button. And so that should be pretty close to the same, but we haven't fixed the one problem that we had around it not the first time. Plus it looks like we got some errors here. remove event listener. Okay, so there is no remove event listener. Spacing the remove event listener. I think we might have to, so it is remove event listener, but we do have to pass the function again. Is that the, move the event target, and then the listener itself. Yeah, so we do have to matching event listeners for removal. Add event listener, mouse, hand on mouse down. Yeah. So this is why it's good to put this into a even more of a function. So we've got, instead of this, we're just changing the text. So let's do a function follow mouse over btn, and then this is going to be btn dot inner html equals unfollow, and then this is follow mouse out btn, and then this will be follow. And what we want to do is then, instead of putting this function in here, we want, oh I see, so this actually does need to be done this way. e.target, oh. This needs to be e.target instead of button. And that's just so that otherwise we'd have to do the event and then get e.target equals the button, or we can actually just do it this way where we say follow mouse over, and oh, this one's for out, and this one is now follow mouse over, and that way we can just pass it the same in here, follow mouse over. Otherwise we'd have to rewrite the whole same function, follow mouse out. So that should fix that. So there's still some stuff, some wonky stuff going on there. Let's get rid of that outline first. So button, I'm just going to do this and we'll say outline none. Interesting. Oh. Yeah. So when we first start out, we are following. When we hover over, it doesn't change that because we need to add those mouse overs on the first pass. So the easiest way we can do that is just say if button.classList.contains following. So if it already has a class of following, then we want to follow button. And what that does is makes the inner HTML to this and then adds those mouse overs and adds the class of following, which it already has anyway, but that won't matter. No. On mouse out, we want this to be following. So there we go. So now any that already have the class of following, the mouse over will work. Any that don't, and so let's just see this. So if I unfollow, now it's follow, and it doesn't have that mouse over, and it's got the standard one. I click again, and it's back to this here. Perfect. So that is working. So now, theoretically, all that should be needed to get these to work is to add the class of button -- following on there. So let's see if that is true. And those are in happening, and these follows, and they already are the button inverted. So instead of button inverted, I'm going to make it button following. Follow. button follow, and they aren't following. And so we saved that, we refresh this, they should look pretty much the same, but one is going to work and the other one isn't. So now it's following. There we go. The class hover is not working because I think I have it explicit to pop up. And so we actually want this to be like that. And I think I'm gonna get rid of this and we'll just say these button follow, and I won't even explicitly specify a button because that way if you're using an anchor tag, we can do that. And then let's just move these buttons up with the rest of our buttons because they're not now explicit to the pop-up. Now we've got our following, unfollowing here, and this one doesn't work obviously because, and so size is obviously an issue, so there must be something in this particular one. So is it good to use case statements instead of if else if there are a lot of choices to pick from? Yeah, so if there's multiple choices and if you are, it's a good question. So in this case we've only got true false, so an if statement works really well on that. But yeah, I would often use a case statement if there's going to be, say, multiple states. So maybe there was like following, not following, subscriber or something like that, then I might reach for a case statement. And there is ways to clean this up as well, even further. A lot of like coding, when you're getting into this, it's almost like molding, and this is one of the challenges I find for sure as a coder, is that I know that I can write this better, so I might spend hours just trying to figure this out. But obviously if you're working for a client, that's not always the best way to do things. So, or you can't always have the budget, you can't just always just play and tweak forever. So when I'm doing stuff like this, I like to actually continue to tweak, and then I just try and get better at things so that when I'm doing them, I don't have to go back over them as much. But there's already things in here that I can see that I can improve. But this functions, so if it functions, that's good. If it breaks, then you might want to tweak it some more. But getting it to work in whatever way possible first and then refining it tends to be a good approach for me anyways. Do I like the arrow functions? Yeah, I actually really like the arrow functions. So this is the arrow function right here, so the arrow function syntax. It's like a lot of different things where so here's another thing too, so I can shorten this too. It's all shorthand. It's just getting into this shorter hand. It allows me to write things like, if I had to write function and then this here, it doesn't work because this actually assigns it as a variable. So that's why it's nice to use arrow functions in here. Otherwise I'd have to use this syntax where I've written a function out here and I pass it in. So that's where I was using that arrow function in line. But because with the remove event listener you have to pass the function back in, then I would have had to actually take and this code, this arrow function, and paste it back into the remove event listener. And then if I updated that function, then I would have to update it both in the add event listener and the remove event listener. So there's where an arrow function is not really going to be a good choice. Does that make sense? And then it comes down to shorthand too. So we've got here's our if statement. So if it's following, do this, else. So like you were saying, we could do that switch statement. Another way we could do it is just with this. So is following, unfollow button, otherwise follow button. And I believe that should work and do exactly the same thing. So there's definitely some padding on that button that I don't want. So yeah, so this just basically says anything on this side, if this is true, do this. If it's not, do this. And so that took us from 5 lines of code up to 1 line of code to do the same thing. Oops. So let's figure out that styling thing. So when it's following, I actually like this size better, even though I think on here we've got, no, it's a better smaller size. So let's keep it at this size here. So button inverted, we have this. btn follow. We'll set the padding to this, and yeah, I'm not really sure specifically why this one's so much bigger. Where is it getting its padding? It's this button follow. Okay. So because I've specified this somewhere, where have I got that? Button follow 1 rem and 1.5 rem. My button follow is here. Let's get rid of this padding and let, there. Button follow, we want there. And that's same down here now. Unfollow, follow, unfollow. Now this one's not. So now same thing, all we have to do is add the class of change button inverted to button follow. And now that should have the same functionality. So you'll notice that when you first select it, so here's an interesting problem. So when I click it, it shows following. If I move out and back in, it shows the unfollow. But the first time I click it, it doesn't do that. So that's actually a really tricky thing to do, because we want the mouse over to only happen if it hasn't already been hovered. So how can we do that? I think the easiest way to do that would be we add the class of following. Let's do this. Let's also class list add first. Okay. So then in here, and I may actually change the color. So the styling happens in the CSS with this hover. I may put the background color change in the JavaScript as well, so that we can control it based on if it's the first time that they've hovered or not. When did you say it would be not good to use arrow functions? So it's not necessarily, well, I guess it is. So basically, if I'm adding this event listener, I could do an arrow function here, which would be like this, right? And then I would be doing this, mouse over, we change that. And let's say we have, so here's a good example. So now basically what I have to do to remove this event listener is I have to copy and paste this up here. because you have to pass the same function in to remove that event listener. So does that make sense? So now we've got this duplicate code. So now if I actually want my mouse over to, so this will work. It'll work no problem when we get rid of it. So actually no, it's still there. So it's actually even not, oh, because the mouse over is still there. Yeah, so it doesn't even work. So here's where if I'm using an arrow function on my add event listener, and I need to remove it, if I know that I might need to remove it, I can't do that because I can't even pass this function in. I have to actually make a reference to the function. So that's where, in this case, I've created this following mouse over function, and instead of doing the arrow function, I pass just the function in. Does that make sense? So that would be a case where I would not use a arrow function. If you know you have to remove the event listener, if you're never going to remove it, it's not a big deal. You can do an arrow function in there. But if you know that you're going to have to remove it, then you have to do it in this function. You can, I believe, you might be able to do this. So you would want to do follow mouse over equals. So you could do it this way if you really wanted to do an arrow function. So then you're still using an arrow function, and I believe this will work. Yeah. Follow mouse over. Oh, this has to be moved up. So this is one of the things too. So if I'm wanting to use this, if I write function, JavaScript compiles it all and knows that this function, it doesn't matter what order it's in. But because now I'm actually trying to reference this follow mouse over before this, I actually have to move it up above this. So it has to be instantiated before. The functions get hoisted is what it's called. So basically JavaScript goes through all of the code and takes anything that's written as function and moves it to the top of the stack. So it compiles those ones first, so then it knows it has access to all of those functions. Whereas if you're using an arrow function, it doesn't get hoisted. So that would be another case too. If you're wanting hoisting, you would not use an arrow function. Is learning things like Bootstrap and React easier once I learn vanilla JavaScript and CSS? I'm worried it's going to be just as hard as when I first started learning and everything was new and foreign. Yeah, I mean, basically, the more vanilla JavaScript and CSS that you can learn, the better you'll understand Bootstrap and React. React is definitely a complex system. There's a lot of the beginning parts of it, and learning the syntax and figuring that out is relatively easy. Like once you actually, if you understand JavaScript, you can grasp it pretty good. But the subtleties of how you actually connect pieces within React, how the components interact with each other. So if you've got a component within a component within a component, how you actually access data on sort of the parent component, that stuff gets pretty complex. So, but definitely the better understanding of JavaScript you have, because at the end of the day, React is just JavaScript functions. So the more you understand how functions work, and things like this hoisting, where like knowing the difference, where if you put a function, if you use an arrow function or you call it a function, and knowing where they get put sort of in the parser is really helpful. And Bootstrap, CSS, I find like it's pretty universal. Like the same thing, I guess. If you understand CSS, then using something like Bootstrap will be a lot easier. If you're interested in learning a CSS framework, I don't usually use them myself. I built my own kind of frameworks that I use, but Bootstrap or any of the other frameworks like that are really good for getting things up and quick. They just look exactly like everything else. So, but Bootstrap's not bad. But take a look at Tailwind CSS. It's kind of it's a newer one that's functional based in a way, so or utility based. So instead of, you kind of learn the syntax of it and then you can adjust it as you go. So you set up a config file that gives you all your styles, and then you can say something like small 7, and small 7 is a specific size. You can say small 6, and 6 is a different size. So I would take a look at Tailwind CSS if you're wanting to learn a CSS framework. Did that make sense? The hoisting and the function differences on arrow functions versus a standard function? Oh yeah, so we were adding the that first thing. So because now I don't want it to hover, when I can do not dot first, and so that will let me click on it and it's not going to show the blue. Did I remove first main? Oh, actually, yeah. So interesting. So that actually already worked anyway. So if I follow now, it shows following. But the color isn't working because it's got that first. So basically what I want to do is on the mouse over, we want to remove this class of first. But now that I'm thinking about it, because the mouse is already going to be over when you click on it, btn is not defined. Oh, it's e.target. So this may, you kind of understand it. Yeah, it's a little bit more complex in it. So basically, let me create a new, or let's just go down here. So essentially, if I am writing my code, I can give a variable name of variable equals 1. And then I can write a function called myfunc, and it will take a variable, we won't go to that, my function, and then this will just be alert. Let's just do v, alert v. And then I can call my func v variable, or we won't even use the variable here. My func hello, and let's just call this message and message. So if I were to run this would work no problem, and it did over here. We write a function, we call it message, and it alerts the message, and then we call the function, and we call it. I can also call this up here, and it'll work exactly the same, right? So it knows that this function exists, because basically anything that has the function tag gets hoisted to the front of the code. So it's exactly the same as if when you actually run JavaScript, it grabs this function and puts it up at the top. So that way it knows about that function. If I write this as an arrow function, and I try to run this is going to work. Oh, if I actually make it an arrow function, no, there. So this, I believe, should work. There we go. But now if I take this and move it up here, now I'm going to get an error. So it's saying reference error, cannot access myfunc before initialization. So it's kind of this interesting thing because it actually knows that myfunc is a function, but this just stays where it is. So this doesn't get executed until it gets to this line. So I'm trying to run this function, but this function doesn't exist yet. Whereas if I move this up, now it's going to work just fine. But using the function syntax, it doesn't matter where you put it. I can put it here, it'll work. I can take this, I can leave this function at the bottom of the document, put it up here, and it's still going to work. Is that maybe more clear? So just something to be aware of in using them. Essentially, an arrow function, you're defining a variable, whereas a function is a function. So why would they introduce a cleaner way to write functions, but only make it execute in a specific order of written in a text editor? So there's probably more reasons for this. I think it's one of the reasons is that because functions always execute in that way, you can't stop it from executing in that way. So this actually allows you to write it so that that function doesn't exist. So from a performance, if you're getting into really, really big apps, if you're using those, it actually makes it so that you have to be a little bit more intentional with your code. So if I just throw all my functions into the file, it's going to load all those functions at the beginning and you'll just have access to them. So it's kind of like using global variables for everything. It works, but eventually if you have a lot of them, it kind of will take a performance hit. So if you're using arrow functions, then you're kind of saying, okay, I know I'm only going to need this function when I get to this part. So I'm going to use an arrow function so that I'm not just bloating the front of the JavaScript memory with all these functions that get stored there. Does that make sense? That's my interpretation of it. There may be other reasons for it as well, but that would be sort of my biggest understanding of why it would be used. Or why it would be done that way. So now when we follow, it stays, and then it adds it afterwards. So that's kind of the effect that we want. So it's just adding and removing that first class. So the first time you mouse over, we remove the class of first. And this is because we're doing the CSS background color. So another way that we could do this with straight JavaScript, which might actually be the better way to do it, let's just try this. So let's leave this remove first in here. And now we'll just see the problem again so that we are aware of it. When we follow, the background changes to red automatically because we're already hovering, and that's just a CSS glitch. So rather than doing this first class, so this is one way you could fix it if you didn't have access to the CSS and you couldn't change that. You could do this where you add a class the first time and then you remove it when you mouse over, because the mouse over doesn't get called until you move over and then come back onto it. Why do I think that this stuff is so confusing, but I'm learning more and more? Yeah, it's certainly complex, and then, like I say, it comes back down to practice, just practicing over, and don't expect yourself to remember all of it either. Like I say, I've been doing this for over 15 years, and I still, like the remove event listener, I had to go look up that on how to do it, because there's just so much that you can't use, and that's one of the benefits, the beauties of coding nowadays, is that you can actually look up and see how other people have solved these problems, and then you can do a combination of here's how other people have solved it and it's worked, and here's with my knowledge how I would solve this, and then you can come up with these unique solutions to these problems, which is part of the fun I find in coding. So why do you think code jobs are so in demand? I think that they're in demand because the internet just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and everything that you build, it's one of the consequences of IT is that you build it and it inevitably becomes a maintenance project. So you also, with all the languages changing, that's why learning a language is never really a bad thing, because there's always going to be a need for people to rebuild things that have been built in older languages, or a need to fix things that are in these older languages. So my first job, I worked for 10 years for municipal government writing Cold Fusion code, which is Adobe's code. And it's not really used outside of municipal government or medical places, is kind of the two main industries that use it, because it's a pretty expensive language to use and it's not super great or robust. It works great, it works good. We used it because at the time it was the only language that had, because it was Adobe, full Adobe PDF support, so we could generate PDFs and we could do document management really easy with it. So we kept with it for quite a while, but there's way better frameworks and way better languages than it now. But because I have this experience in Cold Fusion, I probably could find jobs in Cold Fusion if I wanted to, because there's not a lot of coders doing that. So I think one of the biggest reasons why jobs are so in demand is that the jobs themselves create maintenance. So what do you think about those website builders like Squarespace? Are they only good for static websites for like smaller businesses that don't need dynamic to their web page and functionality? So Squarespace and Wix and even WordPress to some degree, they actually do have a fair amount of dynamic content ability on them. So I would say for smaller businesses who don't have a big budget, it's a really good option, and it gives quite a bit of functionality. Most businesses, I find, will outgrow that if they're Flomar Hoops, thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. Welcome to the stream. How are you today? Yeah, so Squarespace, businesses, I think, will outgrow it fairly quickly. I think that's the thing that happens, that I've seen happen quite a bit with the Squarespace types of sites, is that you can get a site up really quickly, really easily. You can add pretty good functionality to it, and then as soon as they want something more customized, that's when they run into the challenges. Or if you're wanting to go more of an app-based tool where you've got a custom backend, if it's just a content-based website that you're selling some products, Squarespace is a great place to start. It's going to look like all the other Squarespace websites. So if the client is wanting something really unique or really customized or really designed, then definitely it's not going to be for them. This is some good free information. I appreciate it. What a time to live in. To think of people had books for only resources back in the day to learn. Thank you. I'm glad that you appreciate it, and I'm glad that you're learning, and I'm happy to share. I enjoy this. Code is so much fun, and so it's great to have this platform. What a time to live alive when I can just come here and share my hobby with the world and share it with people like you that are interested in this. And so it's and absolutely, I think about that all the time. I was having a conversation with my wife and some friends the other day, and we were talking about how some of the patterns of our parents and the language that they use, and how that can be kind of challenging for people of our generation. And I was pointing out that it's the generation around my age and younger has had more access to information than most of my parents and their parents beyond ever had in their lifetime. It's insane to just think about the amount of information that we have access to, that even 25, 30 years ago, literally, like you say, the only way you could actually have any information was through a book. Like, even just think about the difference between you having access to look up literally anything in a few minutes versus having to see if there's a bookstore within a 50-mile radius that you could go and find a book and read through the entire thing to find information. Like, there's not even a comparison, an analogy that I could draw between how actually impactful that is to where we are today. You notice all the website builder sites have similar themes. Yeah, because trends happen, and so like especially when you're searching for the themes, and especially too, like, clients will see sites that they like, and they'll probably see sites that are similar to theirs, and if they're using Squarespace, they're probably going to be using the same themes. So that's kind of the flow of the internet. It kind of does that, where trends start to surface, and then you'll see a bunch of sites kind of the same. Bootstrap, when it first came out and everybody was using Bootstrap, it was you could tell right away that everything was in Bootstrap. And then people start to learn the tools enough to be able to configure them and change them. So even with Squarespace and Wix is a little bit more limited. You can't make major changes to them. But you take something like WordPress, which was literally a tool that was used just to create blogs for people, and now something like 60 to 70% of the internet is run off of WordPress, all the websites, because it's just so customizable. And that's the power of open source. Open source software is the difference between having only these companies who build software and then they're the only ones who are maintaining it, versus just opening that up to the community to be able to do whatever they want with it. And that just shows the power of community, and that open source is a really great way to get more involved in coding projects as well. People don't understand the amount of information they get for free and don't take advantage of it. Yeah, it is certainly crazy, the amount of information that is available. I went to school for criminal justice, worked with juveniles a little bit. Did not find it right for me. Now I'm a certified professional trainer. And I was on vacation in Miami before the pandemic and realized I wanted to learn code. So I've been learning since my vacation from Miami while training as a part-time job. Very cool. There's a lot of people, I think, especially like during what's happening now in the world, seeing these benefits of remote work, which personally I'm a huge fan of. I think that there's a lot that needs to be done with it, because just talking to other remote workers, and that's where Twitch has been really beneficial for me, that I've tended to work by myself. So I've spent the last couple of years mostly on my own, and I enjoy that. I mean, I'm a coder for a reason. I'm a yogi coder because I like to live in a cave, but it also is nice to have human interaction and have a team to work with at times. So Twitch allows me to kind of have these interactions and work on my craft and share it. But it's really brought to light this fact that remote work is a really doable thing in today's age. But it does require specific things. And I think more and more companies are starting to look at that and seeing how we can support remote workers instead of in the ways that they need to be supported, because it's a different way to support remote employees as it is to employees who are in the office. And there's a different structure that needs to go into play as well. Your girlfriend is a remote UX UI designer? Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, UX and UI, that's a really interesting field. I've been to many conferences. There's a she may even be familiar with it, an Event Apart, which is kind of one of the bigger UI UX companies in the US, that they have a conference at least a few times a year in various places, and they're doing their conferences remote this year too. So I am looking forward to being back to being able to go to conferences and meet people. There's something about that is a lot nicer than kind of connecting to people through a screen all the time. There is something nice about being together with a group of people, and I'm extremely grateful for this technology for this particular time, because the whole entire COVID situation would have been a lot more challenging without being able to connect in this way. So yeah, I'm just going to change the color. That was the other thing that I was working on here. So rather than doing it CSS based, we'll just change the color programmatically with JavaScript, and that allows us to not have to put this first in. We can just have the hover will e.target.style.background color, I think is the syntax. So here's another way too, like this might be CSS, it might be style. I can't quite remember the API for using JavaScript to change the background color. So it's a simple thing that might happen quite a bit, but I would have to look it up. If this isn't what it is, then I would have to look it up. So let's get rid of that styling in the CSS, and let's see if this still works. Yeah, okay. Let me just refresh to make sure. Yeah. So that was what it was. So style, background color. So here's the two different ways that we could have. Oh, there we go. So actually, I need to reverse it when we go back. So this, I think if I change it back to inherit, that might work. No, because inherit is going to be the background color of its parent, which is this white. So here's like an interesting situation where in this particular case, it may be better off to use the first method, only because if I ever want to change the button colors, I have to change it in the JavaScript and the CSS. So I think in this case I will go back to that. But essentially what I'd have to do is change this back to the blue color, whatever that is. Let's just grab it. And now we're doing this just with JavaScript instead of CSS. So now we're going to work, it's going to switch back and forth when we're unfollowed. And there we go too. So if you were followed and you hovered, it's going to keep that red. So in this particular case, I'd have to add 3 extra lines of JavaScript because I'd have to also set it back to the white color if it's not being followed. So in the unfollow, I'd have to set the background color back to the white. So in this particular case, I would probably opt for using the first method. So what that's doing is when we essentially assign a button as a follow button, we give it a class of first, and that's so that when you're hovering over it, and you click, it's not going to make it red because by default CSS still gets triggered if you're hovering over it. So the JavaScript doesn't run. So you see the text doesn't change. Following still stays following until I move over and come back, and then it shows unfollow. But the CSS runs right away. And so that is here, adding this back in, and that's why we add this not dot first. So not when you first change it. We don't worry about the red color, and then JavaScript handles it from there. So that is it for today, I think. Well, next week we'll get into actually placing this. So on the hover, it'll be above the item that we hover. And on these ones here, it'll be the same thing, above or below. And we need to work on, so let's just pull up Twitter to see. Oops, oh, there we go. So when we hover, it shows up above there. If this is below the page, it shows up below, and same thing with these ones here. And then we have a click handler on this one, and it's got a bit of a different styling. So that'll be next week. We'll get into having them actually show up using JavaScript. Are there any other last minute questions or anything? I stream from 10 till 12 Pacific time, so that's where I'm at right now, is around noon. Here is the coding each week. So next week, next Monday, would be the same thing from 10 till 12, and that's when we'll be working on this project. And then on Wednesday evenings from 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. I do pixel art and game development. And then I randomly will stream occasionally on other times, but that's my kind of steady schedule. But feel free to also connect with me through Facebook or on Git there. I'll send that link again. So I'll be uploading this code here. I'll be pushing the changes to that repo. It'll be available. And feel free to send me a message on here, or I'm on Discord, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, or come back to the stream next week and we'll build some more. Thanks for coming and hanging out live stream today. It was great to chat with you and hear about your story too. I look forward to seeing you some more, and same with you, Roach Frags, if you're still around lurking in there. It was nice to chat with you, and I look forward to hearing more about your guys' coding journey, and I'm happy to share my knowledge as you go. We can build some projects together. Now I'm off to get some other work done. I'm working on a project for a medical, it's a React project that is a prototype for some infectious disease tracking software for a local company here in British Columbia, Canada. Just gonna see, we don't got, yeah. Cool. Again, thanks for being here. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Much love.